There is a moment in your psychological development where everything goes quiet, not peaceful quiet, not the quiet you earn after a long week. This is the silence of someone who has finally stopped fighting a truth they can no longer pretend not to see. Jung had a name for this moment. He called it the advanced stage of individuation. If you are living through it right now, I need to warn you about something no one else will tell you. Most people who describe this stage get it completely wrong. They paint it as a beautiful arrival, a soft landing after years of inner work, a kind of spiritual graduation where you finally feel at peace. They talk about it in warm, glowing terms, like reaching a summit you have been climbing your whole life. But that is not what Jung documented. What he actually recorded was far more disturbing, more isolating, and far more transformative than any peace you have ever known. This stage does not feel like coming home. It feels like leaving every place you have ever called home behind. This stage is not a destination. It is a dissolution. The surrender it demands is not the gentle letting go you imagine. It is the death of something you have clung to your entire life. The need to be understood. The need for the world to see what you see. The need for your clarity to be confirmed. When that need dies, you will feel more alone than you ever have. That aloneness is the first sign. Jung spent years mapping what he described as the rarest and most misunderstood territory in all of psychological development. Within his model of individuation, he identified a point he associated with the Sophia Archetype, named after the ancient Greek personification of wisdom. For Jung, Sophia represented the highest expression of the anima, the interior feminine principle that governs intuition, relational perception, and the capacity to hold paradox without collapsing. Reaching this level was not a graduation, it was a confrontation. Jung described it as the moment when a person stops processing the world through the lens of what they want to be true and starts perceiving what is true, unfiltered, and often deeply unwelcome. To understand what this really means, consider a composite profile built from patterns Jung and his colleagues observed across clinical work. Picture a woman in her mid-40s described by everyone around her as the most emotionally intelligent person in any room. She did not just notice things about people. She absorbed them. She could feel the shift in someone's mood before they knew it had shifted. She could sense the tension between two people still pretending to like each other. She knew at a gut level when someone was lying, not from one single clue, from everything at once. For years, she had used this ability to serve everyone around her. She anticipated her family's needs before they voiced them. She smoothed over conflicts before they erupted. She absorbed the emotional weight of every room she entered so that everyone else could breathe. Jung would have recognized this pattern immediately. He called it participation mystique, a term borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl, describing a state of unconscious identity with others. In this state, a person cannot distinguish where they end and another person begins. It is not nurturing sensitivity. It is a failure of psychological differentiation. The self has not yet separated cleanly enough from the collective to perceive itself as distinct. That is precisely what makes the next development so shattering. And here is where the composite profile becomes instructive. One day, something changed, not gradually, all at once. The woman could no longer maintain the unconscious merger. She could not pretend her sister's constant criticism was harmless. She could not pretend her closest friend's passive aggression was anything other than what it was. She could not pretend the dynamics she had been absorbing for years were healthy. She saw everything with a clarity that felt almost clinical, almost cold, and she did not know what to do with it. Jung observed this quality across multiple case profiles. The moment when undifferentiated participation in others' psychological worlds breaks and genuine perception takes its place. an unnatural calm that settled over people in this moment. Not peace, not relief. Something like the feeling when a loud noise stops and the silence that follows is louder than the sound ever was. This is where the advanced stage of individuation actually begins. Not with wisdom, not with peace. With perception so sharp, it separates you from almost everyone around you. Jung identified what he called differentiated perception as the core mechanism of this development. Think of it as a gut feeling you finally stop explaining away. Most people move through life with a comfortable psychological filter. They see what confirms what they already believe. They feel what fits the emotional rules of their family, their culture, their social circle. This filter is not dishonesty. It is a survival mechanism. The collective unconscious runs on shared agreements about what will not be acknowledged. For most of your life, you have played by those rules. But when the merger of participation mystique breaks, that filter dissolves with it. And what replaces it is both a gift and a burden that very few people around you will understand. The gift is this: you see clearly. You see the depression behind someone's forced smile. You sense the desperation underneath a confident presentation. You feel the collective tension in a group that has unanimously agreed to pretend everything is fine. You see the patterns others cannot or will not see, and because you see them, you also see their outcomes. You know, with a quiet certainty that has nothing to do with arrogance, how certain situations are going to unfold. Months before they unfold, the burden is everything else. Because here is the truth no one tells you about this stage. When you begin to see clearly, you do not become a welcome presence. You become a mirror. And Jung spent years documenting what happens when people encounter a mirror they did not ask to look into. He called it shadow projection, and it is the most dangerous psychological mechanism you will face in this stage. Here is how it works. Every person carries what Jung called their shadow, the parts of themselves they cannot accept or acknowledge, the jealousy they deny, the cruelty they rationalize, the selfishness they dress up as virtue. These parts do not disappear because a person refuses to look at them. They go underground, and then they get projected outward onto the people who reflect them most clearly. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. And in this stage, you reflect them constantly, not because you are trying to, but because your clarity is itself a kind of exposure. When you stop performing the collective agreement that everything is fine, you become threatening, not through anything you say, through what your presence implies. Jung documented this dynamic across multiple clinical observations and called it the scapegoat phenomenon. The person who sees clearly becomes the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause the problems, but because they reveal them. The family that was pretending to be close suddenly has someone in it who is no longer pretending. Rather than examine what is being reflected, the group finds it easier to label the mirror as the source of the disruption. This is not a conscious decision. It is an unconscious immune response. The group mobilizes against its shared agreements being exposed, and the threat is simply your refusal to keep pretending. You may have already experienced this, the moment you stopped enabling a dynamic you had always enabled, the moment you spoke a quiet truth that no one wanted to hear, the moment you set a boundary that exposed how little your needs had mattered. The people around you did not respond with curiosity. They responded with pressure, with accusations, with sudden concern about your attitude, your energy, your willingness to be a team player. Jung wrote about this pressure extensively. He recognized it not as a personal attack, but as an unconscious defense. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has exactly two choices. It can integrate the shadow, which is painful and requires courage, or it can attack the mirror, and attacking the mirror is much, much easier. This is the cost of this stage that no one talks about. The isolation is not a side effect. It is a built-in feature of the transformation. Because as your perception becomes more differentiated, as your clarity becomes more settled, the gap between what you see and what the collective is willing to acknowledge grows wider. And that gap is a very lonely place to live. But here is something Jung noticed about that loneliness. It is not uniform. The people around you do not all respond the same way to your clarity. Jung observed, across case profiles showing this pattern, that people tend to fall into one of four responses when they encounter someone at this stage of individuation. The first is avoidance. These are people who sense, without being able to name it, that your presence requires something of them. They do not attack you. They simply drift. They get busy. They stop initiating. And if you push them on it, they will have a dozen reasonable explanations that have nothing to do with the real reason. The second is aggression. These are the people who go on offense. They find reasons to criticize you. They reframe your clarity as arrogance, your boundaries as coldness, your perceptions as judgment. They are the loudest voices telling you that something is wrong with you. The third is fascination. These are people who are drawn to you precisely because of your clarity, but for the wrong reasons. They want you to see them, to explain them to themselves, to carry their psychological weight. They confuse your insight for a service you exist to provide. The fourth is recognition. These are the rarest people in any room. They see your clarity not as a threat or a resource to exploit, but as something they understand because they carry a version of it themselves. Jung called these individuals fellow travelers. Finding even one of them changes everything about what this stage costs you. But here is where Jung's research takes a turn that surprised even his closest colleagues. Because the people who navigated this stage successfully, the ones who did not collapse under the pressure and did not harden into bitterness, shared one specific quality. They had learned to surrender. Not to the people around them, not to the pressure to go back to pretending. They had withdrawn their projections and surrendered the ego's demand for external validation. Jung wrote about this withdrawal of projections as one of the central tasks of the individuation process. What he meant was this: for most of your life, some part of you has been operating from the belief that if you could just explain clearly enough, the people around you would finally confirm that your observations were accurate and your clarity was real. The advanced stage of individuation ends that negotiation, not because you become convinced you are wrong, but because you finally understand that some people are not capable of seeing what you see, not yet, and that this is not a failure of your communication. It is simply where they are in their own development. Consider a second composite profile drawn from the behavioral patterns Jung observed. A man in his late 30s, analytically gifted, who had spent years trying to articulate his perceptions to the people closest to him. He could see his business partner made decisions from fear rather than strategy. He could see his marriage operated on a dynamic that served neither person. When he described this to a therapist, the therapist took careful notes. But in his actual relationships, he was consistently met with the quiet accusation that he was too analytical, too cold, too much. The transformation came not when he found better words. It came when he stopped looking for them. Not with resignation, not with defeat, with something that felt almost like relief, as if he had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down. Jung would have recognized this moment as the withdrawal of projections, the point where the person stops looking outward for confirmation of their inner reality and begins, for the first time, to simply live from it. This is the shadow integration that happens at this level of individuation, not the dramatic integration of rage or grief, which often comes earlier in the psychological journey. This is the quieter and more profound integration of the part of you that believed you needed permission from others to trust yourself. And what emerges from that integration is something that is genuinely difficult to describe without sounding like you are overstating it. Jung was precise and clinical and deeply skeptical of vague spiritual claims. So when he described what he called the integrated personality who had successfully reached this stage, he chose his words carefully. He said they had become conscious participants in the collective unconscious, not separate from it, not above it, but no longer dissolved in it. They could engage with others' emotional atmospheres without being overwhelmed. They could see the shadow clearly without feeling responsible for fixing it. They could hold another person's pain without absorbing it as their own. And they could do all of this while maintaining a stable sense of self, not dependent on external validation. This is the state the Sophia Archetype represents in Jung's framework. Not a personality type, not a life stage, a level of psychological organization where perception and identity are finally separate enough from the collective that genuine wisdom becomes possible. Modern research has given this dynamic a new and useful language. Dr. Elaine Aron's work, developed in the 1990s, documented that roughly 20% of people have significantly heightened sensory and emotional processing. Aron's research was independent of Jung and came decades after his death, but offers a striking parallel to what he observed clinically. Within the highly sensitive population, a subset develops what researchers now call meta-awareness, the ability to observe their own perceptual process rather than simply being inside it. This is the shift Jung was describing in his own terms, from unconscious sensitivity to conscious sensitivity, from being flooded by perception to navigating it deliberately. The modern findings do not prove Jung's model, but they suggest he was documenting something real. And here is where the climax of this transformation becomes most relevant to where you are right now. Because the moment you withdraw your projections and stop needing external confirmation, something unexpected happens. The people who were projecting their shadows onto you begin to lose their grip, not because you have confronted them, not because you have argued or defended or explained, but because you are no longer reacting to the projection with the uncertainty they were counting on. Jung documented a specific pattern in this. He observed that just as manipulative people can unconsciously sense when their tactics will work, they can also sense when those tactics will not. The person who has reached this stage of individuation carries something in their presence that short-circuits the usual dynamics. Not aggression, not coldness, stillness. A settled quality that is difficult to destabilize because it is not performing confidence. It is the real thing. This is what the composite profiles in Jung's observations all shared after their transformation. They did not become difficult or combative. They became what Jung would have described as selectively empathetic, still deeply feeling, still attuned to others in ways most people never are, but no longer pouring that attunement into dynamics that had no intention of honoring it. The relationships that survived their transformation were the ones built on something real. The relationships that did not survive revealed themselves through their collapse to have been built primarily on the transformed person's willingness to absorb what others could not carry themselves. And that revelation, while painful, felt ultimately like mercy. Jung was clear that this stage was not the end of the psychological journey. He wrote extensively about the function that individuated people serve within the larger collective. Individuals who can perceive clearly, hold that perception without being destroyed by it, and engage with the world from a place of integrated wisdom, serve a function that goes beyond their personal development. Societies need people who have developed this capacity. Without them, the collective cannot process its own shadow. It stays stuck in patterns it cannot see from the inside. They become bridges between what the collective is able to see and what it is not yet ready to acknowledge, between the conscious and the unconscious, between what is and what is becoming. Not through preaching, not through forcing their perceptions on anyone, but simply through the quality of their presence and the steadiness of their engagement. This is the final truth about this stage of individuation. The surrender it demands is not a retreat from the world. It is a more conscious way of engaging with it. You stop trying to force people toward the level of awareness you have reached. In that letting go, you become more effective. People who feel judged close down, but people who feel genuinely witnessed by someone who sees them clearly and still chooses to stay, often begin, slowly, to look at themselves more honestly. Jung watched this happen across his case observations. The transformed individuals did not lose their capacity for connection. They deepened it, because they were no longer connecting from need. They were connecting from choice. And connection from choice, freely given and received, is a fundamentally different and more sustaining thing. There is a final caution Jung offered to everyone navigating this territory. He called it psychological inflation, and it is the most common way people derail their own transformation, just when it is closest to completion. Inflation looks like wisdom, but functions like its opposite. It is the moment when a person's clarity becomes identity, when seeing clearly becomes not a tool, but a definition, when perceiving others' shadows becomes a reason to feel elevated rather than compassionate. Jung observed this pattern in people who had survived the isolation and the scapegoating, and then, right at the threshold of genuine integration, turned the clarity into a trophy. Jung was unsparing in his documentation of this. The very same quality of perception that, when integrated with humility, produced individuals of extraordinary usefulness, could, when fused with ego, produce individuals who became the very things they were most committed to exposing. The mirror that forgot it was a mirror, and began to believe it was the source of the light. The protection against this is the ongoing practice of shadow integration in yourself, not just the capacity to see others' shadows, the willingness to keep looking at your own, the recognition that your clarity, however real, is still filtered through a psyche that has blind spots, and that the moment you stop looking for those blind spots is the moment this stage begins to reverse. The composite profile that opened this story did not stop at her moment of clarity. She began, slowly and deliberately, to rebuild her life around what she could actually see. She ended a professional relationship that was financially comfortable but psychologically corrosive. She restructured her closest friendships around honesty rather than convenience. She stopped apologizing for her perception and started using it, quietly and without drama, in service of the people and purposes that deserved it. In a narrative pattern observed consistently across outcomes like hers, the experience of moving through this stage of individuation was later described as the most difficult and most essential thing she had ever done, not because it brought peace, but because it brought something she had not expected: herself. This is what Jung was documenting across decades of clinical observation. Not a spiritual concept, not a therapeutic ideal, a real, difficult, deeply human process of coming into contact with your own perception so fully that you can no longer pretend it away. A surrender that is not weakness, but the most demanding form of strength. a stage that begins in isolation and ends, for those who navigate it consciously, in a more real kind of connection. Not the connection you had before, which rested on mutual performance, but connection built on the sturdier foundation of two people who have both stopped pretending. If you recognize yourself in any part of what has been described today, understand that what you are experiencing is not a malfunction. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It is a sign that something is going very, very right. The discomfort of this stage is not the discomfort of breaking. It is the discomfort of becoming whole. Jung spent his career mapping these territories not to frighten us, but to make them navigable, to give language to experiences that otherwise feel impossible to explain. What his life's work ultimately demonstrated is that the people who move through this stage consciously, who withdraw their projections and surrender the ego's demand to be confirmed, do not disappear into isolation. They become exactly what the world most needs: people who can see clearly and still choose to stay. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.